Okay, so in this video, we're going to look at how archaeology actually works, a little bit of the methods, just so you understand a little bit of how archaeologists generate some of the information that we're going to be talking about. Okay, well, one thing I should say is that this class is in the anthropology department. Even though I specialize in archaeology, I consider myself an anthropologist, and anthropology in the United States has 4 fields. So you have cultural anthropology. Some of you may have already taken anthropology courses already, but cultural anthropology studies recent groups and current groups and looks at their culture. Biological anthropology or physical anthropology looks at the biology of people across the globe through time and also human evolution. Archaeology is what we're going to be focused on, and archaeology is looking at the past of people, and it's looking at the past specifically through the use of what we call material culture. Right? So culture, as we define it in anthropology, is behavior and beliefs and worldview and things like that. Those are cognitive. You can't get at those beliefs with archaeology because the people you're studying are dead. You can't ask them questions. The only way you can get at culture is through what they left behind, what we call material culture. So artifacts, buildings, remains, things like that. So archaeology is focus on the past using material culture. Linguistic anthropology is studying the interplay between language and culture, how each of them affect each other. I'm sure most of you have seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, and I think many people's idea of what archaeology is comes from this movie. And most of you probably have figured out already that the reality is very different from the fantasy. It's a great movie. It's a action movie. It was never meant to be a documentary. And yeah, archaeologists, as you're going to see, are not looking for one lost artifact or focused on some sort of mythological treasure, but rather we're trying to use the scraps of information from the past in order to look at big picture questions. So this is sort of a little bit of a misinterpretation, but much tamer than the things we see today, like on the History Channel, where people say, the Egyptians couldn't have built the pyramids. It had to have been help from aliens, etc., etc. I think Ancient Aliens is already in its 14th season, which is a little crazy. We'll talk a little bit about these pseudoscience ideas and sort of the, can't even say logic, but the illogic behind them. Right? Okay, so some of the meat and potatoes of the course. We're going to look at some of the earliest civilizations in the world. These 5 areas all had civilizations or large-scale societies emerge on their own, independently of each other, without influence from any other civilization. So we're looking at Mesoamerica, parts of South America, Egypt, Mesopotamia, parts of what is now India and Pakistan, and China. Okay, well, how does this work? Well, as I said before, I'm an anthropologist, so I use archaeology, but I study human beings sort of in a big picture perspective. Anthropology approaches the study of humankind using those 4 fields. It's broad. It looks at big picture questions, right? And so that's very important. Another important aspect, as we're going to see, is when we're thinking about history. Right? History only goes back to as long as there have been historical writings. And writing has only been around from about, as we're going to see, 5,000 years ago to the present. Human beings have been on the earth for at least 100,000 years, probably 200,000 years. So 90% of human history of the history of humans on this planet has been without writing and without what we would technically call history. So the only way to get at those time periods is with archaeology, and we would call those time periods prehistory because it's the time before history. Right? Okay, archaeologists, when they're digging a site, have several goals. We're going to just talk about this just for a minute to help you understand how archaeology changed over time. Right? One of the basic goals is when you're digging a site, you want to know who lived there. When did they live there? Right? And that we would call that culture history. So sort of the who, the when, and the what. What were they doing? When were they living there? We just sort of basic facts. Another basic piece of information we'd want to know is how they made a living. Archaeologists sometimes complicate things by using fancy terms for stuff. So how they made a living, we would call a lifeway, past lifeway. So culture history, past lifeways. And then the third goal is in some ways one of the most important goals, and that is why. Why did change happen? So it's not enough to say agriculture emerged at this time. You have to explain why. Why then? Why not earlier? These are some of the main research questions that archaeologists focus on. So the very early period of archaeology, the 1800s to 1900s, we're talking about 19th century, 20th century, was mainly focused on cultural history. People were digging in, and this was when archaeology was brand new. They would go to, let's say, these sites in Egypt. No one really knew much about them, and they would just want to figure out the basics. When did they date to? What was going on there? So culture history. It wasn't until the 1960s that a group of archaeologists said we need to get beyond this and we need to make archaeology more scientific. And they called their field the new archaeology, to try and set it off from the culture history period. And because they were focused on the process of change through time and human history, it was also called processualism, right? So the focus on process. And they really wanted to use a scientific approach using the scientific method. So how would that work? Well, let's take an example. One of the big questions we're going to look at first is the origins of agriculture or farming. So imagine you're looking at ancient farming, and imagine, using the scientific method, you would have to create a hypothesis. Then you collect data, and you would see how that fit your hypothesis. So let's say you need to generate a hypothesis to explain why agriculture emerged, right? So, you had hunters and gatherers long ago, and over time they switched to farming. So pause the video in just a second, but what I want you to do is, on a piece of paper, try and think of a reason to explain why people might have adopted farming or invented farming. Can you come up with a reason? You don't have to have any background archaeology or anthropology to try and figure out a reason to explain why farming emerged, why agriculture emerged in ancient times. So why don't you pause the video right now, come up with a reason, and then unpause the video. Okay, so what did you come up with? Again, you don't have to have any background in anthropology to try and come up with a reason. Some of you may have thought, well, what about, overpopulation in ancient times? Maybe the population got so big at a certain point that they had to create more food. That put pressure on people. They wanted to make the food more productive, and over time they eventually developed agriculture or farming. That would be a good hypothesis. You could use the scientific method to then go out and test it. Well, how would you do that? Well, you'd pick an area of the world and you'd say, okay, do I have archaeological evidence that the population was getting big before we see agriculture? If the population was getting bigger, and then you see the appearance of agriculture, that would support your hypothesis. If the population stays pretty much the same, then you see the appearance of agriculture, there was probably something else going on. It doesn't really support your hypothesis. So this is how new archaeology or processual archaeology works, as we're going to see. Well, after the 60s and 70s, so the mid 70s, 80s, people realized, the scientific method is great for answering certain kinds of questions, but some questions can't really be answered using the scientific method alone. And also, if you're approaching it strictly as a science, you might ignore some of the human aspects of the cultures you're studying. So postprocessionalism came into being. And today, archaeologists use both. So any archaeologist you meet will use the scientific method and ask big research questions, but they'll also use art, interpretation, other fields to look at other aspects of a society. Okay. Now, if you had to guess, when I tell people I'm an archaeologist, what would you guess one of the most asked questions is? Well, I'll tell you, one of the most asked questions that I get asked is, how do you know where to dig? How do you actually find archaeological sites? And locating archaeological sites is, really one of the most important parts of archaeology. Now, you can see this individual over here. This is the famous Iceman named Otzi. He was found in the Alps by accident by hikers. He was found face down. You can see this is why his arm is bent like that. When hikers found him, they called the police because they thought this might have been a murder victim. And the police found copper axe and reed matting and all these ancient tools right next to the body. And they realized this was an archaeological find. He's perfectly preserved. He's, I think, 3,000 years old. They've gained so much information from Otzi. It really was a remarkable find, but it was found by accident. Archaeologists can't rely on a lucky accident, to find archaeological sites. They have to find archaeological sites on their own. So in the next video, we're going to see how that happens.